God functions in different ways in our lives, right? And I need you to ask the question, how is God functioning in my life? So one of the ways that we got and allow God to function is, I call this the God outside the circle. The God outside the circle, right? This is what I mean by the God outside the circle. If this is your life here, God really is outside of your life. In other words, we treat God in our life the way we treat the moon. You say, well, what's God tied to the moon? Well, let me say, we know the moon exists. We know the moon is out there. Every so often we'll glance up at the moon and we're like, wow, a full moon or a half moon or eclipse. But the moon really has no relevance in our life. We just know it's out there. And that's how we treat God. We know he exists. We know he's out. Every so often we'll glance up and say, God, wow, you did something today. Wow. But the reality is God really has no relevance in your life. That God really isn't integrated in any area in your life. He's just out there somewhere. That's the God outside the circle. But then there's a third way. It's the God in the circle somewhere. The God in the circle somewhere. Now, this is where a lot of church people operate, because the God in the circle means God is enough in your circle for you to be religious. See, this is where a lot of us operate, because God is enough in our life for us to have spiritual conversation. For us to know the spiritual talk. God is enough in our life. Well, watch this. God is a part of all the things we do in our week. You know, I go to work. You know, I do this. I go to the beauty shop. I go to the gym. I run my kids to school. I go to their game. And oh yeah, it's Sunday. I come to church. That's the God. He's somewhere in your life enough for you to be religious and be spiritual. And watch this. God really, when we say unless the Lord build, God don't want to be outside the circle. God don't want just a space in the circle. But what God wants is to be the center of your circle. And see, that's different when he's the center of your circle, because when God is outside here, he has nothing to do with anything in your life. When God is somewhere in the circle, you choose where you want God to address, and you choose when you need him and when you want him. But when God is in the center of your circle, God drives, God orchestrates, God dictates everything that happens in your life. Where is God in your life? See, and what reset means is I have to look at my life and I got to ask myself, is God properly positioned in my life? Because what happens is sometimes, and we all have to face, sometimes our life kind of drifts apart from God being the center. That's the nature of life. We get preoccupied with everything, and we look, and what happened is we've allowed God to drift. So that he's no longer in the center, he's drifted out here. And resetting says, I need to assess, where is he in my life? And when he says, unless the Lord builds, unless the Lord is the center, watch this. The next part of that, we labor in vain. You know what it means when we labor in vain? We labor in vain means, that word means progress. It means hollow. It means empty. In other words, when the Lord is not the center, what happens is we don't get traction. We don't get traction. Here's a question I want to ask you. Don't raise your hand. How many of you are stuck? How many of you look at your life or an area in your life, and you made resolution after resolution after resolution, but you're no further ahead in that area this year than you were 5 years ago? This is what he says. He says, unless the Lord builds it, watch this. Unless the Lord builds it, you really don't get much traction. Unless the Lord builds it, you really don't make much progress. Unless the Lord builds it, what happens is you find yourself in the same spot spinning your wheels. See, unless the Lord builds it, I can take any one of these areas. Unless the Lord builds my marriage, I'm going through the motions. I'm not getting much traction. Unless the Lord builds these areas, I'm going. And you know, he said, and I labor in vain.